Yeah. Hello, everyone. Hi. It's a great pleasure to welcome all of you to today's webinar on Indigenous Economics. Thank you. Thanks a lot to everyone for joining and participating in this event. I hope for a lively discussion. And I also hope that you can all hear and see me now. So this event is jointly organized by the Rethinking Economics group in Oxford and the Critical Indigenous Studies Network. Both of these groups have a very profound interest in the topic of Indigenous economics. My name is Theodor Bormann, and I'm a member of the Critical Indigenous Studies Network, which is, just to give a brief introduction, a network that was created last year as one of the research networks of the Oxford Research Center in the Humanities. And as a network, we aim at bringing together academics and non-academics to critically discuss issues related to Indigenous knowledge systems and practices, worldviews, Indigenous identities, and Indigenous struggles. So a key question in this regard would, for example, be how to decolonize our own academic practices, be they related to theories, methodologies, or curricula. So this term, we've organized an event series on Indigenous futures. In week 2, we had, for instance, an engaging presentation on the decolonization of archival practices. And the week after, we were joined online by Nancy Train, who is the CEO of the guardianship of the Wanganui River in New Zealand. So that was the river that got famous for winning the legal personhood rights in 2017. And the talk by Nancy was also recorded, by the way, and can be found online. Same with the talk of today. And next week, there will be a performance by Shona artist John Falsetto, who's currently a visiting fellow here in Oxford. Before introducing our speaker, let me hand over the screen to Zoe for a moment, who will give some more background to the Rethinking Economics group.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I'm Zoe. I'm part of the Rethinking Economics network here at Oxford. So Rethinking Economics is a student-driven initiative which has expanded into an international network, and it basically seeks to diversify the teaching and studying of economics by introducing a diverse range of heterodox theories and schools of thought and methodologies, and basically just tries to tackle a lot of the issues surrounding the teaching of economics and how that's done, and how that usually focuses on much more classical schools. So we're delighted to be joined by Ron Trosper today to study or find out a little bit more about Indigenous economics. I know a lot of you are already involved in the network, but if you want to find out more, then just go check out the Facebook page for Rethinking Economics Oxford, where you can find everything about open meetings, online events, in-person events, and talks that are on.
Yeah, thank you so much, Zoe. And now, after this introduction, it's my really great pleasure to extend a special welcome and thanks to our speaker, Professor Ronald Trosper, who's joining us from the United States. It's rather early in the morning for him. And Ron is currently Professor of American Indian Studies at the University of Arizona. He's a very multidisciplinary scholar, so he does not only work in American Indian studies, but also in economics, particularly in ecological and indigenous economics, and as well as in policy studies, anthropology, and forestry. Ron received his PhD in economics from Harvard University in 1974. His thesis was supervised by Albert Hirschman and Nobel laureate Kenneth Arrow, and analyzed the impact of settler colonialism on income in Ron's reservation, which is the Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribes of the Flathead Indian Reservation in Montana. After his PhD, he worked briefly as an assistant professor at the University of Washington, but then left to work first for the Council of Energy Resource Tribes and then for his own tribe. In 1989, he rejoined academia and became associate professor and then full professor in the School of Forestry at Northern Arizona University, worked then as professor in the Faculty of Forestry at the University of British Columbia, and has since 2011 been professor of American Indian Studies at the University of Arizona. He has published a wide variety of articles, book chapters, and co-authored books. In 2009, he published a book entitled Resilience, Reciprocity, and Ecological Economics. And last year, he published Indigenous Economics, Sustaining Peoples and Their Lands, which we will talk about today. I think that I speak for all participants of this webinar when I say that we are very excited and glad that you were able to join us today, Ron, and that we're very glad that you've agreed to tell us more about Indigenous economics and how it changes economic theory at basic levels. So thank you so much for your participation. And so even though most of the audience is invisible and inaudible, I would like to ask everyone to give a warm round of applause to Professor Trosper.
Oh, thank you. Well, that part of Zoom I had not experienced before. So I'm glad to give this presentation. The picture behind me is from my reservation, the Flathead Indian Reservation. And we at the reservation just managed to obtain control of the National Bison Range. So I was there this summer and took a picture of some of the bison. We had, when the reservation was opened for allotment in 1910, which was 1908 and 010, at the same time, a portion of the land was taken in order to have a bison range. And so we've been struggling for years to get it back. And we now control it, and we're very happy to do that. So let me start a PowerPoint presentation here. There we go. So this is the title of the book that I published this summer, Sustaining Indigenous Economics, Sustaining Peoples and Their Lands. And this is kind of the summary of what I've been learning over the years teaching about Indigenous economics, both in schools of forestry and in American studies. So the outline of what I'm going to present, I'm going to talk a bit about how this happens around the world, living well by developing relationships, where living well is a translation of buen vivir from the Spanish. Relational persons and groups are the agents, so we instead of focusing on individuals, we focus on groups. Another important thing is that the relationships include all beings in the territory. The clear assumption that comes from indigenous peoples is that all beings are capable of communication with humans, not necessarily talk, but some sort of communications. So after I develop the theory a little bit, I'll give some applications to identity, territorial relations, externalities of public goods, sustainability in relation to leadership, and relational entrepreneurship. That's sort of the outline of the book. So let me begin with living well through relationships. And I want to draw a contrast. Those of you studying alternative economics are probably aware of this, that development it became a goal for underdeveloped countries after World War II. And a sociologist by the name of Ronald from Switzerland wrote a book of the history of development, and he proposed that you can observe three characteristics for development: destruction of the natural environment, destruction of social relations, and increase in the production of commodities. And this is something that he said, go to third world countries and you want to see, are they having development? See these things happening. The first two involve destruction of relationships, and the third satisfies individuals. So if we want to say, reverse the characteristics, let's say we want to live well, have buen vivir, as they say in the Andes, we replace development by enhancing relationships. So we talk about enhancing relationships with the natural environment, enhancing social relations, and put increases in the production of commodities as sort of a side event, not the main purpose. Oh, let me get this under control here. So some examples that I start off with in the first chapter of the book is there's a project in Ecuador, the Tunguhoran project. It's next to a volcano of the same name. And there was a conflict there about upstream, downstream relationships and the supply of water. And some external people suggested that they set up a payment for ecosystem services. The indigenous people said, no, we don't want to commoditize water. So they talked about building relationships within the river basin, and they came up with a good plan. And it's described a bit in my book. In the Pikangikum elders, who are Algonquian people in Ontario, next to the border with Manitoba in Canada, they decided that they wanted to build relationships with the Natural Resources Department of the province of Ontario, and they engaged in writing a plan for taking care of their forest. They did persuade the Ontario government to let them establish a industry of forestry on their own land they would run, and it wouldn't be the kind of clear cutting that had gone on in neighboring areas. It would be rather a lower level, lower scale development. They would still be using their pine trees as a source of income. Now, my previous book is about the feasts and houses on the Northwest Coast and the way the people on the Northwest Coast manage salmon fishery. And I talk about how the Haida people of Haida Gwaii have created a national park in cooperation with the government of Canada, and they have an agreement with the province of British Columbia that reduces the cut and manages forestry in cooperation with that government. You had a lecture on the river in New Zealand. I'm sorry I missed that. I'm going to look up the recording of it, but I think that's another example of building relationships. In Montana, in the United States, we've just had a national monument established, Bears Ears National Monument, which was the lobbying for that was a cooperative effort among Indigenous peoples in Arizona, Utah, and Colorado, and New Mexico. The Bears Ear National Monument is in Utah, in the southeastern part of Utah, and they have a co-management agreement with the Department of Interior and the Department of Agriculture. It's really pretty interesting. I start the book with points. My main point is that building relationships is not some old idea from Indigenous peoples or only applicable to Indigenous people. Is that building relationships is something that Indigenous people are doing right now around the world, and this is just a few of the examples. So the first thing to focus on in Indigenous economics is that relationships, not individuals, are fundamental. Talk about relationships among humans and relationships among humans and all the rest of creation, so that there is respect for individuality. Each person is respected because of their unique relationships, and their autonomy is respected. And in some ways, the respect for personal autonomy is greater in relational societies than it is in individualistic societies. I'll get into that in detail. A point is to change the model of a person from the sort of robotic type person that we have in standard economics, one which recognizes that people have internal conversations. They think about what their opportunities are, what they want to do, and they extend those internal conversations to conversations with other people. And in the process of discussing the ideas with other people, they establish relational subjects, which are groups of people that share relational goods. Originally in Indigenous communities, it would be families, clans, societies, villages, and tribes. These days, one can create a relational subject in the form of a cooperative firm or even a profit-making firm that doesn't focus on profit primarily. But the point is that a relational subject is a group of people or a group of relational subjects who are generating relational goods that they share among themselves. One can have kinds of relational subjects at micro level, meso level, and macro level. This replaces the individual nation dichotomy. In economics, the theories are built based on individuals that exist within a framework of a nation. And that doesn't work very well if you have relational subjects, but relational subjects can join into some sort of macro level agreement. So I'd like to focus a little bit of attention on this concept of relational subjects. The theory that I'm using, I found wandering through the library, Northern Arizona University some years ago, when I came across a book by Margaret Archer, an English sociologist, written a series of books on relational subjects, and she just recently published a book co-authored with her and an Italian sociologist, Pierpaolo Donati. Two of them had been working independently, and they discovered each other's work, and they found that they really were talking about the same thing, coming at it from different directions. When I came across her work, I thought, wow, this is a useful structure to replace the individual as a basis of talking about economics. So when creating a relational subject at the lowest level, say, and the most clearest example would be a husband-wife or husband-husband relationship, or wife-wife, any one of the small family relationships that we see. And in doing so, persons talk with each other about their personal and group goals. They find ways to share among themselves and do things together. A couple will establish a loving relationship. An extended family will have a loving relationship as well as other things that they share. One aspect of sharing trust and love among themselves is that they have reciprocity. That's a well-recognized result of group cohesion. I started working on reciprocity myself, studying potlatch in northwest coast of North America, where there was a remarkable historical and archaeological record where for over 3,000 years, people on the northwest coast had managed to live in a reciprocal relationship with salmon. Both the people and the salmon had prospered, and it was really a puzzle, because here in standard economics, if you let individuals have access to fishery, they will overfish. But how was it that the people on the northwest coast managed not to overfish? And what the answer was, they set up relationships and they shared the catch. Famous example of the potlatch feasts on the northwest coast is how they managed to share the fishery. So people would appreciate the sharing that salmon gave to them. Salmon were very generous in coming back to their natal streams, dying and providing for everybody. But they added in ideas of sharing among themselves and creating incentives to restrict overfishing. And you can imagine that if each fisherman is in an individualistic situation, they want to catch as much as they can and share it with just themselves. But if they're forced to share the catch when they get back to shore, or when they take the fish out of the river, as they would do at the northwest coast, because they know that they will get a share of what other fishermen catch, the incentive to overfish disappears. I developed that in a whole argument in that book. But then the mistake I made, or what I didn't understand with that book, was why were people doing a reciprocity, and that the reciprocity is a consequence of building relationships. So that's what I ended up doing, is focusing on building relationships and then deriving the idea of reciprocity in economic affairs as a solution. So in my third chapter, I talk about how people support relationships. And there's probably another kind of set of rules or set of actions to support relationships. I've taken this list from a very good book by Roger Fisher and Brown of Harvard University Negotiation Project. They were very interested in telling the United States and the Soviet Union how to form a relationship while they negotiated. And they decided that when people negotiate, they should do what's good for themselves, should do what's good for a relationship. And in the process, they will come up with one of in the case of the United States and Russia, an enduring peace. And the Haudenosaunee people, or the Iroquois people in the northeastern North America, and other peoples in that area, also had practices that correspond with these. And so they had a peacemaking process that provides rules much similar to these. So the rules are, first of all, in negotiating, recognize both emotion and reason. Not just a rational process, it's a process of deals with emotion. When one is negotiating with someone else or forming a relationship, you need to know how others see things, what their view is, and recognize it. You don't have to have the same view that they do, but you have to understand their view. And before making a decision, you always consult and listen. And in the process of consulting, of course, the decision will change a bit, but everybody will agree to it. And in the process of having a relationship, each individual should act in a trustworthy manner, but not fully trust, because it needs the other person also to show that they're trusting, or the other people in the relationship. I'll stress trust later on. In negotiating, it's important to persuade rather than coerce. And so among the Haudenosaunee, for instance, proposal was made in a negotiation. There was no requirement that people respond to it immediately. We're given time to think about their response. That is an aspect of negotiation. People often say, well, decide now. Don't decide now, I'll stop talking. Well, that's coercive, but it's important to be persuasive. It's also important to not just learn how other people see things, but deal seriously when making proposals. Among the Haudenosaunee, a serious proposal was always presented with a gift of wampum belt. And many of these belts have survived. Symbols in the belt would indicate what the proposal was. And of course, Fisher and Brown point out that these things support each other. One should recognize the connections among these practices. If one does support relationships, then the result is some relational goods, goods that are shared among the people in the relationship and aren't really available to outside of the relationship. The Haudenosaunee had, Deganawida is famous as the prophet who went around to the various tribes in Haudenosaunee territory and suggested that instead of fighting with each other, they were in a series of wars, that they should follow certain rules, which were the ones I just listed. They would create health and peace. That would be a shared good, equity or righteousness, and civil and spiritual power. So if one talks to Haudenosaunee people today, they will say, well, what we need to do is form relationships and we'll have peace, equity, and power. Some people will say health, righteousness, and power. The translation of the Haudenosaunee words are many, so we actually end up with 6 names rather than 3. But these are emergent effects of people having relationships. It's create trust among the people, create teamwork among the people, harmonization in an orchestra as a result of their relationships, solidarity among people. These relational goods kind of look like local public goods for economists. But the difference between a local public good and relational goods, these relational goods are only available to people in the relationship, and they have a subjective component. They're not something that's purely objective. A local good might be clean air in the city, which is available to everybody that visits the city and the city, and it's not subjective, objective there. But in a local public good, trust, for instance, has a subjective component. Teamwork among people and a sense of solidarity, those are real things. They're not purely objective. And they are types of social capital. I was writing my book, the reviewers said, how come you haven't mentioned social capital? I knew why, because social capital in the literature is often described in individualistic terms. But if people are in social relationships and they answer the questionnaires that folks are using to measure social capital, they show signs of positive social capital in their preference. So I had talked about, I want one more slide here, I think I want to do before I question is one of the people of Aotearoa or New Zealand, the Maori people, have many ideas or many words for public goods, social, relational goods that they produce, their relationships. And one of them is vana. And mana is something that there's an article published recently called The Economy of Mana. And another word for this might be called an economy of affection, where people recognize affection among themselves. And there are levels of mana according to Maori thought. There's the mana that comes from universal connectedness with the world. There's mana that's inherited from the genealogy by recognizing of relationships and the history of people. The mana that I focus on the most is connections of people and land in relationships, so that you have a healthy relationship, you have a healthy system, you have a healthy river, and there's things for everybody. Mana is also a characteristic of a personal power as a result of a person joining into a relational subject, that their own personal power is increased as well. And as I was working on my book, there was an op-ed in the New York Times by some people from New Zealand who said, in New Zealand, we have the principle of mana ki tikanga, which is taking care of mana. And as a result, and they teach it in the schools. And so when COVID-19 came along, the leadership in New Zealand could say, well, we have to take care of our mutual power. We have to recognize that together we can defeat COVID-19. And they were an island that helped them, but other islands such as Great Britain didn't succeed in necessarily dealing with COVID as nearly as well as they did in New Zealand. Managed the first few years to really keep it under control until the vaccines came along. Lately, there's been an outbreak of individualism, which is kind of not surprising. But during the period of dealing with COVID-19, they did very well with enhancing their mana. So I'd like to stop what I'm going to get into next is to start talking about identity and levels of relationships. But I think I'd like to stop to see if Theodore has gotten any question boxes that would come along.
Yeah, thank you very much. There has indeed been a question, I think it was raised 2 or 3 slides ago on relationships. So the question is, let me read it out and put it into the Q&A chat. So the question is, how are relationships impacted by migration flows and the growth of large diasporas? Can group cohesion be maintained despite geographical scattering?
That's a really interesting question. I haven't thought very much about it. My feeling would be that what I'll say is a test that I teach about in my course in traditional ecological knowledge. That is, if other beings have plants and animals which seem to be exotic, they've migrated, say, to North America, one asks of these plants or animals, are they useful? Are they productive? Are they willing to obey the rules that we already have here? And if they're able to join the society in a productive way, they're able to stay. But if they don't want, if they arrive and they're very disruptive, then they're not encouraged. And among humans, they'd be asked to leave. The title holders in the Northwest Coast made this point that they would say that the laws are the laws of the land. The laws are the laws that we've developed in living with the land. And if foreigners come in, they have to respect those laws. And if they don't, they leave, or they're asked to leave. This is what the title holders said. They said, we would have been willing to be nice to you folks, but you don't obey our laws. And so they were fighting with the folks of British Columbia who refused to recognize the rules that the title holders had used. And the immigrants managed to overfish and to destroy the fisheries. And I would argue, and I argue in my book, that if they had joined in with the rules of the title holders that were already in place, they would have been welcome and things would have gone a lot better. So I think it's a question, if you have established relationships and you have people coming in from abroad, the question is, are they willing to join the new society that they're coming to? Are they going to be insistent on retaining their old ways of getting along?
Yeah, thank you very much.
Yes, that I would say.
Yeah, so there was, I think the question also, there was a second question, which was, can group cohesion be maintained despite geographical scattering? So one is like immigration, and the other question is like the inverse, basically. What happens to it in the case of immigration?
Oh, if people leave, well, I think that we observe that people who have left their homelands and come to cities often maintain their relationships with the people that from where they've left. And anthropologists were quite surprised in Alaska to discover that the natives in Alaska would leave their villages and go to Anchorage or go to Seattle. They would maintain connections with their homes, and there would be a lot of remittances back home because they had come from a very relational society, and they maintained those relationships even as they found other ways of making money. So that the villages did not disappear. The villages did not assimilate into the society in Alaska that was being built by the United States, but rather in the cities, the people who were migrated kept their connections to home. And I think that's probably a worldwide phenomenon when people from very strongly relational societies travel abroad. They maintain their connections and they send food home, send money home, and they go home when they are done working in the cities. And this is a pattern, in fact, I've observed in my own family. My father grew up on the Flathead Reservation, left, went to work for the federal government, worked in the Wilderness Society. When he retired from the federal government, he moved back to the reservation. And others who have retired moved back. When we got control of a hydroelectric dam, we discovered a member of the tribe that had been active in the electricity industry in Texas, came back, and he was volunteered to be head of our chairman of the board for our electric company. So we had an expert from within the tribe who could help manage this company that we set up to manage a hydroelectric dam. So I think that recognizing that immigration doesn't cut relationships with home society is important. I suspect nowadays, with the massive numbers of migration that we have, I don't know if people are able to maintain their relationships, but in less fraught times, they are able to do so.
Yeah, thank you very much. Very interesting. Another question is in the chat, which is more general. How can we insert these ideas of non-individuality and mutual support and well-being into today's economics? That's the question.
Well, I think that people are doing that. Folks establish cooperatives instead of for-profit hierarchical firms. We have a lot of nonprofit organizations, a lot of community organizations that are set up. In many cities, there are efforts to start agriculture in the cities and share the food. In the United States, there's a group surrounded by the magazine Yes, capital Y, capital E, capital S, exclamation point, that is publicizing a lot of efforts by people to build community, build relationships. And some of the founders of that group urged that folks just stop using the corporate economy and generate alternative economies and trade with each other. So I think the ideas are out there and people are doing it. The difference is they don't necessarily see that the countryside is alive in the way that indigenous people.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Ron. So also I'd like to invite everyone to post your questions in the chat in the Q&A box, and once they come up, if we see them in time, we will try to I will try to check, ask them, or Ron will see them and will answer them directly, probably. So yeah.
So I need to correct you, Theodore. Zoom as long as I have my PowerPoint on the screen, I can't access the Q&A box. I don't think. Let me see. Let me see if I can. I just see something.
Okay.
Let me see. Let me see.
No,
Wait
no
a minute.
problem. So in that case, I will monitor the Q&A box, and
Yep,
yeah.
no, there. I just figured out how to do it. It's
Okay.
at the top of the screen, not the bottom of the screen. So, okay, and then it disappears. All right. We exit out of that. Good. So I want to go on to my next slide. So once we've talked about, let's get this going here. Once we've talked about the concept of relationality, it's helpful to recognize that relationships can be built at lower levels, such as within families, at the level of villages, where people share common tasks and share the identity of themselves within the village. These are the types of relational subjects that are preserved when people in the village travel to another place to work and then come home, send remittance back. Or you can have associations of villages and have a national level of relational subject. And historically, the example that I like to use all the time is the Haudenosaunee League, the United States, which had 5 and then 6 tribes of different related culture, but different languages, who associated with each other and were quite powerful in negotiating with their neighbors. So it's important to, I'll get to this more later, but I want to get into application of these. And turning to Indigenous peoples, one of the characteristics that we have is that Indigenous folks establish a sense of peoplehood. And some of the professors at the University of Arizona, before I got there, had published an article by Tom Holm and his co-authors called Peoplehood, based upon other work that had been gone on in that area, in the southeast Arizona area. And they suggested that peoplehood emerges from the members of a tribe engaging in 4 major actions. Ceremony, that they would have ceremonies that they share, and that these shared ceremonies strengthen bonds among the people, form relational agents. Nowadays, here in Arizona, some of the ceremonies, particularly ceremonies that happen around Easter time, are very widely attended by other people, but the people who participate in it are the Yaqui people, and they really emphasize their unity through the ceremonies that they hold, which are a combination of Christian work, because it happens at Easter time, but then the story that they tell is not the Easter story, it's a different story. And that's a major ceremony at the national level. Territory is included in the relationship. So people have a territory and they feel it's home. They maintain their relationships with that territory. They talk about the history and sacred history that they've had with their territory, and define the growth of relationships. The sacred history is a way of changing the actual content of the identity. I've argued that for my tribe, on the Flathead Indian Reservation, we had 3 different bands get together and be forced to live on the reservation. As they lived on the reservation, they came to form a sense of unity, and the unifying symbol was the treaty itself that created the reservation. So we would have events in which we would celebrate the date of the treaty, and when we were arguing to get control of our dam, went to the site of the treaty making at a big event at the University of Montana. And I see that, in a sense, the treaty became part of our identity. It's a unifying force. Same thing happened in South Dakota and North Dakota. The Lakota people would emphasize their treaties. This annoyed anthropologists because they felt the treaties were not traditional. But the indigenous people said, well, they're very important. We have these treaties that keep our land separate, and we want to focus on them. And they unified the bands of Lakota around their treaties. So the history is a way that the content of identity changes over time. And everyone has their own language and their own stories about the past. We have a book that describes the identity of Flathead people on our reservation, and some of those stories are very important, but some of them are stories of relationships with settlers, bad relationships typically, but they're also good relationships. The story of how Flathead Indians invited the Jesuit priests to come establish a church, and so consequently, my tribe is highly Catholic. Jesuits were very helpful in letting the tribe adjust to agriculture. So peoplehood identity is something that is really important in Indigenous studies, and American Indian Studies at the University of Arizona stresses it. And we've had master's and PhD students, excuse me, write the dissertations on using the concepts of identity. One of the key aspects of identity is relationships to territory. My third chapter talks about people and identity. My fourth chapter talks about territory. And I really get into it because I want to distinguish the territorial system that was used among the Algonquin peoples after the fur trade and contrast it to an idea of private property. So an individual private property, which folks in study economics know, is that things are owned. Owners have full control of these things. They can sell them and they manage them using their own ideas without review, although in most governments there is some review by the government. They have privacy in relationship to their own land, and they're able to exclude other people, especially from land. However, there was an economist by the name of Harold Demsetz, wrote an article towards the theory of private property. He published it the year I graduated from college. And he claimed that as a result of the fur trade in northern Canada, the Indians created private property in the form of family territories, and they emerged as a solution to open access problems. However, anthropologists have gone and studied and talked to the folks, the Cree and the Ojibwe and Chippewa, the peoples who descended from those folks, and they discovered the family territory system is still in place, but it is far from a private property system. So Harold Demsetz would claim that private property emerged, and he was wrong on the facts. What's there now is not a private property system, and you can show that by looking at the rules for selecting leaders, processes of reaching agreements, the rules for information, the payoff rules. One of the payoff rules is sharing the product of the land, the choices that are allowed in the scope of general income. So those 7 lists, if I go into them, I'll have a whole other lecture, but I took them from work by Eleanor Ostrom about how to set up a system for comparing territorial systems. If you apply that full analysis, you discover that the Algonquin peoples and peoples on the Northwest Coast did not then and don't now have private property. In particular, they had relationships structured by ownership, by relationships, not markets. They did not have a market in land, for instance, which is so obvious. If Demsetz claimed there was a private property system, should have noticed the absence of a market in land, which is necessary for a private property system. I'm very appreciative of the Cree trappers in their process of arguing with the province of Quebec. They wrote down their rules. You can go to this spot, the creetrappers.ca, and they've published their hunting law. And you can analyze that hunting law and just using the 7 categories that I just listed, and show that it's a good coherent system, but it's not a private property system. And lots of Indigenous peoples have relationships with their territory, and they allocate land within the territory by use. They recognize exclusive use of some of the land by people in the territory. They do things, especially allowing control of parts of the land and exclusion of other people. So they do have a system that kind of has private property, the idea of exclusion, but they don't treat the land as a thing, and they don't have a marketed land. So it's not a private property system, but it is a territorial system. So I figured as part of indigenous economics, I had to describe I had to provide a way to describe relationship between people and land. It's fundamental. So that's what my fourth chapter does. And then in the fifth chapter, I talk about how systems of relationships deal with externalities. And the externalities in economics are described as common goods and public goods and toll goods, not private goods. And the type of good is defined by depletability and excludability. So a private good has complete depletability and excludability. Own a private good can exclude other people, and your use of the good depletes the quantity of that good. And in economics, those of you who have studied economics, you recognize that a public good doesn't have depletability and doesn't have excludability. So that some people who share a public good, which is clean air in a city or clean atmosphere in a world, can't exclude other people. And no matter how much one person uses, there's the other, it's still there for everybody else to use. That contrasts to a common pool good, such as a fishery or water system or groundwater system or a grazing area that's used for grazing. There is depletability. The more that individuals use common pool good, the less of it there is, but excludability is expensive and difficult. And so if it's not an absolute, a group of people could exclude other people. Within the group, they have to deal with the fact that they need rules to assess how people use the common. And in economics, there's a huge literature on the dilemmas that public goods and common pool goods create. For public goods, the problem is underinvestment. Everybody can share, and so nobody has an incentive to invest because you can't get your money back because it's no accessibility and no repeatability. And common pool goods are a dilemma because of the race for fish and much attention has been given to this topic. I got started in studying the potlatch by noticing that potlatch consisted of sharing the output of a common pool good fishery. And you can revise the prisoner's dilemma model in a very quick way and turn it into a different kind of game, which people have an incentive to cooperate. So relationality, by creating relational goods like trust, solidarity, equity, identity, can address the problems and the dilemmas of common pool goods. And it's no accident that indigenous peoples around the world are very good at living with territory that is essentially common situations. And so if non-humans are included as entities that can be communicated with and can respond to good treatment, then people will create relationships with them, which ends up supporting and maintaining biodiversity. If you talk with many indigenous people, they will say, well, every being in our land has a role and a position that we have to respect their needs as well as our needs. So it's no accident that the hotspots for biodiversity in the world are where indigenous peoples have established relationships with beings in their territory. In my class on globalization, we've just examining this phenomenon of conservation organizations creating parks to protect the biodiversity on the land. Then they exclude the people who've been working to preserve the biodiversity all this time. Extremely frustrating to have that happen, and it's happening these days. But the consequence is that biodiversity and the strength of the land is supported by people who have relationships. A brief history on this, we know that Garrett Hardin revived awareness of the tragedy of the commons in 1968, using literature from England. In fact, he quoted lots of people about who were advocated enclosure in England of the commons in England. And he suggested two erroneous solutions: private property, which is them said about, or state administration. Eleanor Ostrom, who received a Nobel Prize eventually for her work, refuted what Hardin and others had said in her first book, Governing the Commons. And then the people who established the International Society for the Study of Common Property, or the International Society for the Study of Commons, they quite sensibly got the word property out of their name, have gone on and developed her ideas. What I do in the book in chapter 4 is suggest that we can understand what she has proposed by reorganizing her 8 principles. What she did is she studied some very long-living common property regime, irrigation regime, and grazing common, and she's proposed 8 rules. And what I do in my chapter is I separate the rules into principles that are actions to strengthen relationships. So these 3 rules, which she lists number 3, 4, 5, and 6, I think they are the causal rules. That if people involve all persons in a common, that use the commons in making the collective choice decisions, this is an example of always consult before deciding, they start building relationships. If they monitor each other, and this helps building relationships. If they have persuasion in their enforcement of their rules by graduated rewards and penalties, this surprised her. She was surprised that just teasing was enough to get people to obey rules. And she also recommended that dispute resolution be low cost, be done within the community. And I argue that they're essentially applications of the 6 rules I listed earlier. And as a result, you create relational goods. And the first of her principles is that you have group identity. You can identify who is in and who is out of the organization or common property regime. And the people in this common property regime have shared goals about managing common property. They also share their input and their output in the common with principles of equity. So she says that participation is proportional. Contributions are proportional to results, and benefits are shared in a fair manner. Then in her presidential speeches, when she got when she was president of American Economics of what she did 2 presidential speeches. One that I used is her Nobel speech. And she says in that speech that actually lots of folks have pointed out, in order to have these 8 principles work, you need to have trust. And my insight is, well, of course you have trust, and trust is interior to the system. If you create relationships, you create the relational good called trust, and that feeds back and allows you to strengthen the relationship and do all the good things. Trust itself is a consequence of relation building in a managing common good. So I say that her first 2 principles are actually results of her 3rd, 4th, 5th, and 6th principle. Then she adds 2 other requirements which really extend the theory very well. First of all, the people have to have a right to organize. There needs to be a minimal right to organize, which I relate to saying that relational subjects respect each other's autonomy. And the relational subjects exist in a nest. So there's associations of cooperative groups, and they recognize each other's autonomy, and they create polycentric governance. So one can go on and develop this relational theory to talk about what polycentric governance is. And these are external requirements to her analysis, which was of the meso level relational groups that were managing commons. So I kind of like this. We provide a reason for why Ostrom's principles make sense, and we add trust, which she said had to be there too, but she didn't realize, because she was really heavily influenced by standard economics. Although in her later reading, you can see that she is getting fed up with the model of man in standard economics. Let me think here. I think this probably next step that I'm going to go into is to talk about leadership. And before I do that, I think I'll make one more slide before I go into leadership. I want to point out this is the idea that creating relationships overlaps with the principles of CPR management. It's not a one-to-one thing. Collective choice by consensus, combination of always consult before deciding, learn how others see things, and deal seriously with people. Monitoring each other's behavior is a matter of being seriously with people and being not wholly trusting. Graduated sanctions is a matter of persuading people rather than coercing them. And easy conflict resolution is what I'm going to get to next. And that's the idea that one needs good leadership to maintain good relationships. But let me stop here and see if there are some questions answered. Go ahead, Theodore.
Yeah, thank you very much. There are two questions. One is on peoplehood identity. So the question is, how can one recreate peoplehood identity if ceremonies and stories have been lost? So does it make sense to study past ceremonies, to look to other groups, or to create ceremonies and stories from the scratch?
I think it does make sense. As I pointed out, the stories change with time as a result of history. And the good thing about the peoplehood identity is it gives you categories to look for. It gives you things people do as they build relationships. And of course, they have to be renewed by each generation. Ceremony that dies out stops being useful, but if people remember it, or if a neighboring community has the ceremony, they can report it. So doing peoplehood is a matter of folks keeping on reproducing their sense of peoplehood in every generation. And so it has to be a living thing. It has to be something that changes with times, can't be fixed. And if something's lost, well, maybe it should have been lost. Maybe it wasn't useful anymore, given the changed circumstances. Do you want to repeat the question? Did I cover every point of it?
Yes, I think you covered it, yeah.
Okay.
Then the other question is, how would we need to change the education system to instill the kind of non-individuality that would benefit society and the well-being of individuals?
So one of the key duties of elders and of leaders is to educate children. And so a problem with the education system is it divorces education from society in a way, not fully. I mean, the educational system is very heavily influenced, at least in the United States, by local school boards. So the educational system is the way that parents reproduce their way of thinking and help children learn a new system. And Robin Kimmerer has a chapter in her book, Braiding Sweetgrass, in which her daughter goes to school and is asked to recite the Pledge of Allegiance, which is kind of an individualistic statement. And instead of having a Pledge of Allegiance, she would rather have classes give the Haudenosaunee Thanksgiving address. So you start off a meeting by thanking the world for supporting humans. You thank animals, you thank the fish, you thank the plants, you thank the sun, you thank everything, because humans depend upon the world in which they live. And this could be put in place of the Pledge of Allegiance or some other pledge to the national government. And so there are things in the educational system, but in the United States, the people that study education are discovering that folks learn in groups. So you have collaborative learning processes. Here at the University of Arizona, we've created collaborative learning classrooms in which there are tables. 4 to 6 people can sit at a table and work together, teaching each other. So they're learning relationship building and they're teaching each other. And that's a change in the educational system that's pretty profound. It's coming from good research on the part of people in education. And that is my way of thinking. That's teaching people how to be collaborative and teaching them how to work together. And it's applying essentially some indigenous ways of teaching that that are good. And so one can turn to that. So there's another point that is often made in indigenous studies, and that is that land can teach. And so that in order to learn about the land, you need to be out on the land. And an example of having the fact that the land teaches, in the United States, we had a disagreement when the federal government started applying the Indigenous Species Act on reservations. And many of the tribal leaders said, why are you picking just those animals to protect? You have to protect everything. And they continued to argue, and they had a big meeting, and Charles Wilkinson, a lawyer who works with tribes, went to the meeting, and he said he did not realize the extent to which indigenous people really knew the land. So these meetings were very detailed meetings about the land. That was because the indigenous people spent their lives growing up on the land, and they really understood it, and they could argue with the biologists toe to toe and do very well. So what happened in the United States is they set up a rule that if you have a habitat plan that meets the standards of the Endangered Species Act, you don't meet the standards without dealing with all the rules that the U.S. government puts in place. And my experience has been, once an indigenous tribe writes a good habitat plan, biologists that work for the Fish and Wildlife Service approve the plan because it looks like really good biology to them. So that's sort of my answer. I think education is a place of change, and I see very encouraging things going on if you add in collaborative learning and you get people out on the land to solve problems that are land-based. Are there more questions?
No, those. Thank you so much. Those were like the two questions for now.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I'm nearly done here. I've gotten to slide 17 of about 20, so 21. So anyway, my next slide has to do with easy conflict situation and leadership. So that, oops, I made a mistake. Hold on. If you push the wrong button, you do the wrong thing. And if you're talking, you lose track. So my next slide, it's not the next slide, next slide has to do with sustainable leadership. So if one has a system of relationships, one needs to have individuals who are responsible for helping people maintain their relationships. And Ostrom found this out when she said that there had to be local systems of dispute resolution, which I say means that leaders are peacemakers. If people have a dispute, a good leader is someone who can help them solve the dispute. And leaders are accountable to their people then for maintaining relationships. And so what do leaders do? They help resolve disputes among members of a tribe or a group. They support relationships with non-humans. So if somebody is mistreating non-humans, they get teased, they get told to shape up. And so leaders support relationships with non-humans. For fishing in a community that has good rules for managing fishing, and you don't fish according to the rules, they'll come over and start teasing you. And that's supporting relationships with non-humans. In his book, Sacred Ecology, Frequent Burke says several chapters on fishing. And that's one of the points. He's a good fisherman, but he would break the rules. And when he broke the rules, everyone would come over and start correcting him. He was experiencing how leaders support relationships with non-humans. Leaders also nurture the collective. Rather than giving orders, they give advice. They suggest things that leaders can do. And in some communities, like in the Pueblos in the southwest of the United States, the folks that do the day-to-day leaders are young people, get elected to the councils or selected to the councils. They take advice from the elders. The elders are supporting the collective by supporting the day-to-day leadership. Another characteristic is that leaders support the autonomy of persons and respect what persons want to do and want to be. And I've observed this in my tribe, that when members of the council, when we have somebody that's sort of making trouble, they kind of look at that person and they say, well, what job would they be comfortable in? One of my best examples of that is you have somebody who's out there poaching. A good job for them to become is to become somebody that enforces the non-poaching rules, because they get respect for enforcing those, again, catching the poachers, and they're very good at catching the poachers because they know how to do it themselves. So people find ways to put persons into the right roles, and this supporting the autonomy of persons, I think, is really important. And leaders do that, and encourage other people to do that, encourage people not to treat each other in oppressive manners. And this is something that's really important. And one of the things that distinguished indigenous people in North America from people in Europe is they had a variety of sexual roles. Priests, when they got to North America, were quite upset. Men that dressed as women and women that went hunting and all sorts of people that weren't obeying the rules of what a man or a woman should be. And that was an aspect of looking at the autonomy of persons, what they want to be, letting them choose what they want to be, and then letting them do that and contribute to the community in the way that they want. So that's what leaders do. Leaders also do education. They support socializing next generation. They also are responsible for the stories. A community has stories about their history, and the leaders, sometimes, in order to become a leader, very often you need to be able to tell the stories in ways that everybody thinks correct. Leaders support social memory. And there was a recent set of articles describing the Guna of Panama, who are very, very relationally oriented. And they talk about how do Guna deal with crises and how do they promote sustainability. So this is my last lesson, which I don't have as subtype point, is that we talk about relationality, we can redefine sustainability. Sustainability is the sustaining of relationships, not the sustaining of the land. It results in the sustaining of the land. But if you focus on sustaining relationships, the consequence is sustainability. And numerous Indigenous authors have made this point, particularly in the journal called Current Opinion in Environmental Sustainability, has had a series of special issues on Indigenous knowledge. And I had a special issue on sustainability, and Indigenous authors emphasized that sustaining relationships is what causes sustainability. And finally, I want to get to entrepreneurship. So entrepreneurship is how people run firms, how people get things done, provide livelihoods. And the literature on Indigenous entrepreneurship emphasizes that entrepreneurs, to succeed, have to address community goals. They need to do the things that, like I said, leaders do. Entrepreneurs are a kind of leader. They need to sustain relationships with land. They need to sustain relationships with people among themselves. Maori, there's an article authored by Shelley Spiller and others that says good entrepreneurship among the Maori focus on well-being. They focus on the well-being of their customers. They focus on the well-being of the tourist areas that they are using for getting people to come to their country. They focus on the well-being of the country that they're visiting. They just focus on well-being, which is, of course, another way of saying good living, as running their entrepreneurship. And there are examples of relational enterprise. And I was asked a question earlier about how can we do this in the contemporary world, and
Sorry to interrupt, Ron. I can't hear you any longer.
Oh, you can't hear me?
Oh, now I can hear you again. Sorry. Yeah.
I must have looked away. Oh, I have a note. My computer says to me my internet connection is unstable. So I'll get closer and I'll talk louder or something, but we're having internet connection issues. I think you're a long ways away. So within nation states, there are laws that allow people to organize cooperatives where the workers own the cooperative and share the profit among themselves and set the rules for joining the cooperative and not. There's quite a literature in Europe. There are lots of cooperatives. And in the United States, there are some. And in Canada, there are laws that allow cooperatives to be set up, and the Indigenous peoples of Canada have used those laws to set up cooperative organizations. So those are relational enterprises. And we have a literature on entrepreneurship on tribes. And what people do is they revise the public-private distinction. And in the literature in the United States on entrepreneurship, people talk a lot about separating politics from business, and by which they often mean run your business enterprise in a way in which the boss runs everything in a hierarchical way. If they run it in a non-hierarchical way, it's called politics. And one of the characteristics of a relational society is there's lots of politics. And it's a question of how well is the politics run, rather than is the politics separate from the business. But very often, set up your business separately, and there's a good reason. If you're trying to do business with folks who aren't relational, if you do business with individualistic people, you kind of have to look individualistic for them to feel comfortable. Lots of young Indigenous scholars who try to teach in business schools are publishing articles about ethics in business. And they talk about relational ethics. And that's an interesting literature that's growing. And also there's these co-management relationships with governments that I mentioned. And I would say that when an Indigenous leader sets out like the Pikangikum elders did to build a forest plan in cooperation with the Natural Resources Department of the province of Ontario, they're establishing co-management relationships, and that's actually relational entrepreneurship. So I kind of, in the chapter on entrepreneurship, I try to reinterpret what's out there from the point of view of seeing that there are highly relational enterprises, there are highly hierarchical enterprises, but all of them have to address community goals. So even in a hierarchical casino in the United States, the profits go into supporting tribal goals. They don't go into the pockets of if they do go into the pockets of the leaders of the tribe, the rest of the people in the tribe get very mad, and there's a huge fight about it because the profit is supposed to go to community benefit. So my final chapter in the book, this is the end of the sort of Indigenous economics work. I have an afterword in the book in which I talk about the contrasts between the two theories. And on the one hand, we have neoclassical economics. At the other hand, we have Indigenous economics. And so the basic unit of analysis in neoclassical economics is said to be individuals, but in Indigenous economics, it's relational persons and relational agents. Neoclassical economics assumes individuals have preferences, act like robots. In Indigenous economics, we assume that people talk with each other, they consult each other, and they make decisions from their talking. And you can see this in the game theory people. They've discovered that individuals have preferences to cooperate. And if you have people in an academic experimental situation, if you force the individuals to be totally non-communicative, they don't solve the problems very well. If you let the people talk to each other, they solve the problem. So they get around their preference. Neoclassical economics is absolutely adamant about methodological individualism. They assume that all theories have to start from models of individuals. Whereas in Indigenous economics, we talk about the emergent structures of agents, relational agents, the micro, meso, macro level, and the behavior of agents when they're in a macro mode are explained by their relationships among themselves, not by the characteristics of the persons lower down in the individual level or in the meso level. And this business of methodological individualism, I'll make a little side note for the economist. When I was a young economist trying to make my way in economics departments, I liked macroeconomics. And so I studied macroeconomics and taught the intermediate level. And about this time, the rational choice people were taking over macroeconomics. And they said, you need to found your model on models of individuals. But then they discovered that if you have models of individuals, the mathematics of adding up preference functions are very tricky. They have to be very strictly formed in order to add up. And so these theorists in macroeconomics said that, well, they'd have a representative individual. They treat every individual as the same, and then they build their model. Well, they ended up building models that did not do well during the big recession in 2008. And people had to go back to the Keynesian models, which were models of emergent structures. They weren't models built on methodological individualism. So anyway, Indigenous economics, like other people doing other kinds of economics, have to get rid of methodological individualism. Neoclassical economics is based on private property, which teaches living things as property, as things. Whereas in Indigenous economics, very often we talk about tenure based on use, with a tiered set of relational subjects who monitor each other. So if a person is misusing the land that they've been given exclusive rights to, they lose their rights because they get monitored by others. Neoclassical economics has a state. Indigenous economics talks about plural national associations, groups. The Zapatistas have said, we want a world made up of many worlds, which by many worlds, they mean each of the individual communities that can associate to trade with one another. So you have a state is made up of a plurinational association of groups. Some of our states have provinces, Canada, United States, Australia have provinces, but those provinces themselves are run like states. So they're not a plural association of relationships. They're association of top-down states. And the difference in firms is neoclassical economics, you model the firm as contracts. And in Indigenous economics, you model the firm as relationships. And it's interesting, the neoclassical economists, they end up saying, well, we have incomplete contracts. Contracts are incomplete, and we have to model the fact that they're never complete and talk about what happens in principal-agent relationships when the contract can't be written to cover every contingency. Well, that's a real nice way around the problem, that what you really need to do if you're talking about persons and agents is build relationships in which the boss is responsible to the workers are responsible to each other, and you generally monitor each other and have strong relationships. And that does kind of goes past the point of view of the contract-oriented neoclassical economist. So I'll give two more slides, and then we can discuss. We may not have enough time to go into a presentation contrasting these theories in more detail. But the problems of standard economics is emphasis on selfishness omits or distorts the fact that humans want to share and respond well to reciprocity. Individualistic focus creates a bias against valuing relationships which matter for Indigenous people. So they're an individualistic oriented person in this tribe, and they say, this is a bunch of communists. Well, that's wrong. It's a bunch of relational entities. Communism assumes individualism, assume everybody the same, is everybody the same, and everybody has to take orders from the boss. So people mistakenly address Indigenous peoples as holistic communist type the groups, and they're not, especially because they respect the autonomy of persons so well. The assumption that more material consumption is better and is the long-term goal of economic system doesn't describe indigenous values of environmental and cultural sustainability. And of course, in ecological economics, there's a huge literature attacking putting material consumption as the main goal. And focusing on nation states for individuals omits the many intermediate relational possible structures that exist and are coming into existence. And so these are all foundational assumptions. If you change them, much of the standard theory becomes inapplicable, but some of standard theory can be modified. And I would cite principal agent theory. Think about that in a relational framework. Maybe some of those models work. Others, so if you change the assumption of the rational choice macroeconomists who took over macroeconomics for 20 years, it's really hard if you deny the emergence of actions at the economy-wide level. It's really hard to build a sensible model. You have to go back to Keynes to do that, and he was arguing with the neoclassical economists all the time. So that's my brief. For those of you that are in the alternative economics group, that's my brief presentation on heterogeneous, different kind of economics. Let me stop for questions, Theodore.
Yeah, thank you so much. So far there are no questions in the chat, I believe. Let me check once more. So if anyone has questions from the audience, please just like put them into the Q&A box. I have actually a question. Basically, I would be very interested to know about your personal experiences of teaching Indigenous economics in economics or business departments. Is this possible at all? Probably like at the University of Arizona, have you had like experiments? Do you know of any other attempts?
So I have twice approached the economics department at the University of Arizona to cross-list my courses. My course is a simultaneous undergraduate graduate course, and they say they will not cross-list a course that says it's about economics unless I have the principles of economics course as a prerequisite. Well, that's a condition I cannot accept. I cannot accept a principles of economics course because it assumes people are motivated by selfishness, assumes people have preferences, assumes private property is the best thing and all that. And so if you're going to insist that I already adopt your principles in order to be in your department, no, I won't do it. And that's the experience I've had. I've given up trying. It's too monolithic. I'm one person. I'm perfectly happy to teach other people. I've made presentations to the department. I've talked to their economics club, but I've made no headway in the formality of getting a cross-listed course.
Yeah, I'm very sorry to hear that, but yeah, I can imagine it's like a very difficult fight in a way to transform the economic discipline.
And they socialize the young economists. There are economists who see the problems and are willing to. I have a PhD in economics. I myself studied all the basic theories and can do a good model of how selfish individuals behave and all that. And some of the models you don't necessarily have to assume that. You can go things in a different way, and there are other models used. But if you're asking at the ideological level and the who's in charge level as to who can teach a course in their department, they say no. You have to be that one of them in order to do it. And notice that I actually was rejected by 2 economics departments in the process of my career. First department I was in, I was joint appointment, and they did not want to continue my first 3-year appointment. So I went to another university. Went up for tenure, and they said, "Well, you do really good work, and you contribute to our research seminar, and you've published in the American Economic Review, but we don't want to be known. we want to be known for things that are famous in economics. And we don't think indigenous theory is going to be famous in economics. So I went elsewhere. And I ended up in forestry because forestry is inherently a multi-resource field where the interaction between the deer and the trees and the water, all the interactions are very important. And they discovered at the University of, at the School of Forestry at Northern Arizona University, that the only people that looked at the forest in a holistic way were the tribes in Arizona, but they couldn't keep their students in school. So I went to work helping indigenous people complete forestry degrees. And then I went to the University of British Columbia, where similarly, the forestry school recognized that the indigenous people in British Columbia had rights to the land. And so their foresters needed to know about indigenous viewpoints. So they hired me to teach a required course on indigenous viewpoints in forestry. So I was so fed up with economics, I never even approached the economics department. Some people might complain. Let me stop for just a moment. Okay,
Yeah.
my monitored phone has been monitored. So that it's a personal fight. I'm thinking that younger people, there seem to be a lot of young people getting interested in these ideas. And let me say that good luck in working with economists as you get promoted. Maybe you can be more open-minded.
Yeah, thank you very much for that, the very personal answer. It's very interesting. Yeah, so there are no more questions in the chat. So do you want to go back to the presentation, to the conclusion, and then we see if there are any other questions from the audience? So please feel free to just write them into the Q&A box or into the chat. And
yeah, I think we probably used up the time. I just want to say as a conclusion that each of my chapters makes a different point. Living well by developing relationships, the first chapter addresses globalization challenges. The second chapter focuses on indigenous persons as an alternative to persons with preference. Third chapter focuses on levels of relational subjects and talks about how they build indigenous identity as described by Peoplehood. The territorial chapter takes on the private property theory people and objects to private property because it reduces everything that's not a human to a thing, and things aren't allowed to talk back. In my relational theory chapter, I show why Ostrom's principles are correct, and they derive, in fact, from good relationships. I give a better concept of sustainability. Sustainability is helping relationships persist. That's what leaders do. And relationship entrepreneurship does exist now in cooperatives, many nonprofit organizations, and in co-management arrangements with governments. And then I have an afterword that summarizes the fundamental critiques of standard economics. But I'll be too bitter if I go through that. I've discovered I've talked about my history of relationships with economics departments. I've had a good academic career by going into American Indian Studies and into forestry. So it's no problem at that level. So that's my summary.
Yeah.
Thank you, folks. Thank you, folks, very much for inviting me. It's a pleasure I love to talk about my own work. And so it's a pleasure to be able to do that. And thanks for inviting me.
No, thank you, Ron, very much for joining us. It was really like a great pleasure. Thank you so much for sharing not only your knowledge, but also your wisdom, I felt. So that was very inspiring, very interesting. And yeah, so since there are no further questions, I encourage everyone to also spread the word that the recording will be online. And yeah, thank you very much once more to Ron.
Oh,
yeah.
Tell them to read the book.
And read a book, yeah. So yeah. So and yeah, thanks to Ron, and also thanks to all participants for joining us here today.
You're welcome. Yeah. I really enjoyed it.
Wonderful.